Vanguards of Misguidance. Returning us to slavery. By the counterintuitive. The world delivered into your home and your mind, returning us to slavery, The Obsolescence of Man by Gunther Anders. The story here is an attempt to trace four seemingly separate histories into a single narrative and timeline. Figures, messianic prophecies, psychological conditioning, and transnational capital have literally manufactured warped human beings. The figure of the mass man, Gunther Anders. Emerging from, but not specific to the West, yet speaking globally about the dissolution of the individual into a vapid mass subject to doctrines and roles, right down our current age, that we can rightfully understand as the Capitalocene. I am trying to anticipate the process of collapsing societies, of the past and present, fraught with commitment and illusion, worse evangelic guidance or the promise of liberation, eventually returning us to slavery. Pretext: the end justifies the means. There is a high probability that the distinction between ends and means has been rendered absurd, is lost, especially within our technological society. Why? Because both, means and ends, are two parts, one philosophical and the other practical, in relationship. The two are infused, stuck together, within layers of culture, ethics, education, indoctrination, and eventually rendered useless by one or another form of mass technology vis-a-vis the demands of capital. Gunther Anders unboxes the absurdity of justify as a fake formula that ensures the simultaneous legitimacy of the two categories at the same time. Real humanity, according to Gunther, however, only begins to when faced with concrete fragments of life or its disintegration in a technological world, where one can no longer understand or even question whether they are means or ends. The Obsolescence of Man by Gunther Anders. From this milieu over time emerge many vanguards of misguidance. As cult figures, messianic voices, and masterminds of world-making world destruction. Because the entire planet, people, animals, ecosystems, all that can be understood and exploited as means, their noble goals are most often based on pure illusion. Objectively speaking, nothing good is achieved in reality for the proletariat, while heading for overall obsolescence. The journey towards the spring is just as good as drinking from it. The evangelic business of purification. Sabbatai, Levi, Zevi lead thousands of Jews into the Ottoman Empire, via his visions, indoctrination and call to unite under God, instead of the synagogues and the ruling clergy. Nathan of Gaza proclaimed Zevi a Messiah around 1666 CE. A little later, to everyone's surprise, Zevi converted to Islam. That shocked and dismayed many of his followers. Zevi and his devout loyalists won big favors and land in return from the Ottoman elite, and Sultan Mehmed IV. Centuries later, Jacob Frank, a self-proclaimed Messiah, would set the first chapter of Dark Enlightenment in motion. Following the pending matter of reincarnation via Sabbatai Zevi, this new Jewish religious mysticism followed socio-economic webs to collectivize. Zones of war, zones of poverty, zones of relative prosperity, and zones of mercantile exuberance. Jacob Frank was expelled from various places and imprisoned for 13 years for his total disregard of the rules of modesty, Tiesnut, Judaism. Albeit, his devout followers set out in all directions possible, with practices based on purification through transgression. Jacob Frank's teachings were the guiding principles for future Frankists. Various sects and their horrendous practices, including ritualized orgies, bloodletting, incestuous acts, most notably between fathers and daughters. Clearly deliberate acts, set according to a calendar, against pre-existing Jewish laws. Adopted as the V, also represents Jacob's ladder. Messianic or plain horrific, Jacob Frank believed such rituals were necessary to hasten a messianic redemption through embracing the abyss of sin. Whatever haste and redemption that never came, a bizarre simile appears through history, in terms of evangelic hysteria, the unfulfilled Messiah and violence, between Israelis of today, Zionists, and their Jewish ancestors, like Sabbatai Zevi, Jacob Frank, Moses Dobruska, Paul I of Russia, even later with founder of modern Zionism like Theodore Herzl, J.E.V. Jabotinsky, and David Ben-Gurion. The current genocide in Gaza is not about some Zionist vision that is impossible to achieve, but the collapse of human rights, international law, accountability, resolution, and diplomacy. Frankist mobilization, however short-lived, would predate the Jewish class of bankers, moneylenders, financiers, scientists, and psychoanalysts by centuries. Frankism initially aimed Jewish communities in Poland and Lithuania. Over time to St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, Vienna, Slav territories, Hungary and Romania, and later into Ottoman Turkey. The city of Vienna became a thriving base for many future Jewish influential figures, 18th and 19th century. After the collapse of the French Revolution, many of the remaining Frankists in France believed Napoleon Bonaparte as a potential messiah. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers killed in France, Germany, Prussia, Austria, and Russia as part of Napoleon's disastrous imperial plans, the prophecy fulfilled. Money is God. The Dutch Golden Age, 1580 to 1670, created the Dutch Republic during the Rampjar. Popular history recounts the period as Dutch trade, scientific developments, art, and overseas colonization was among the most prominent in Europe. Wikipedia. What goes unaccounted for is the process and collusion of movements that lead to such a golden age. A century of reformation of the sacred and the material as means and ends, effectively guiding huge number of Europeans to migrate as well as reorient Christianity. One example of the above historic process is about crypto-Jews of Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, Lisboa, Bilbao, and Toulouse. Folks who migrated to Holland over decades, causing a huge transition of wealth and business routes. Famous philosopher Baruch Spinoza being one prominent figure of the above exodus. The transition, 1610 to 1660, from the Iberian Peninsula to Holland and England, would effectively bust the future prospects of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, as well as energize the Rampjar. The Protestant success of Rampjar is rooted in the worship of capital vis-a-vis God, specific to the emerging super-rich bourgeois. Also specific to early Calvinism, eclipsing the Hispano-Habsburg Dominion, Spanish, Austrian, Portuguese, Italian, and French royalty, within Europe as well as newly colonized territories. Grandeur that rested upon the economic expansion was not an outcome of Dutch ingenuity and maritime power alone, but the coming together of various forces into one almighty world logic. Of transforming nature, faith, people as well as the invention of natural wealth, means justify ends as industry, commerce, profit, and material abundance. Yet abundance for who? In the words of Calvinist, Jacobus Arminius, the poorest and hungriest masses of our faith have been driven to destitution by the merchants and the Church of England. The Reformed have retained elements of Catholicism, bishops and their bullion investments, people facing loss of faith and absolute poverty. We have no choice but to abandon this godless land. Is why the English let William of Orange, Stadtholder of Holland, to become the King of England, effectively combining two rivals, two maritime routes and empires into one mercantile world-eating system, against Leviathan, Freddie Perlman. Protestant logic and religious discourse would go through tremendous evolution in England, 1660 to 1700. Concurrent inflation in England, France, and Flanders, Belgium, led to widespread starvation during the 1690s. While the period is often framed as part of European Enlightenment, it also marks cycles of exodus and abandonment. The formation of the Bank of England, 1698, vis-a-vis shareholders' ability to divert colonial wealth to all possible frontiers, to fund future wars, speed up acquisition, ramp up slavery, maritime traffic, and send out hundreds of missionaries to all possible corners of the planet. Akin to a parasite that could cross oceans, or as one sequence inside a world colonizing project, the Puritans landed in the New World and immediately set out for the pending messianic predicament, aimed at the land and plenitude of the indigenous or so-called Red Indians. What many historians based in the West prefer to call pilgrims were a class of people, as God-fearing and as hungry for material wealth, at the primitive foundations of money is God. The old ends justify means as the new manifest destiny. Benjamin Franklin's multiplication of natural plenitude and virtual wealth when he compared number of pigs in a farm multiply into more and more dollars over time. Max Weber's criticism of capitalism. Franklin was devoted to capital's devious rules, that time is linear, nature is free and resources are infinite. Shortly later, the United States and the money as God rule would manifest as the highest bastion of individualism and private wealth. From Plymouth, 1606, to Washington, 1696, to Los Angeles, 1886, expansion of capital and colonies, as a world praxis, the Puritan victory of money is privilege is noble is God. Participating in a religious service or the economy, higher education, charity, sports, travel, even leisure or comfort can all be bound up within the cycles of capital and money. People employed not just in factories, farms, ports, frontiers and nation building, but the very pre-production of the mass man, directed at the service of capital. Indeed, that justification is still firmly rooted within every capitalist society and whatever political economy. From the above milieu emerged transnational capitalism. What are generally labeled as secret societies such as the Freemasons, Frankists, Vatican orders, Rothschild, Jehudan Cavalleria, Jesuit missions, Mendes of Antwerp, etc. were the early arteries within the growing body of capitalism, 1500 to 1800. What underpins seemingly opposing sects, faiths, nationalities, and cartels was the potential for spiritually compromising one's unequivocal commitment to God. The obsolescence of man, Gunther Anders. Whatever differences of compromise or commitment aside for the moment, underpinned by the logic of the end justifies the means was, and still is at the heart of all such promises, reformation and constant rearrangement of power. For example, the Dutch East India Company at its apex, 1750 to 1800, was a floating maritime nation with its own juridical powers, military and naval garrisons and regulated currency. Hundreds of routes or colonial arteries moving transcontinental labor, wealth, products and prospects, while funding endless wars and conflicts erupting in every corner of the empire, and back home, between the most ravenous masterminds of Europe. A legacy that includes key figures like Napoleon Bonaparte, Wilhelm II, Queen Elizabeth II, right down to imperial figures like Benjamin Disraeli, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, to Nazis and fascists like Adolf Hitler, Francisco Franco, Benito Mussolini, followed by revolutionary or messianic figures like Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Mao, etc. Marxism, revolution, and transnational capitalism. Whoever wins and whoever recedes as the figure of the defeated and deposed, the power of capital must expand. Go and seek out every possible means to agglomerate its power, Richard Spencer. Is exactly why the Wall Street invested in the Bolshevik Revolution. Shocking or counterproductive as it may sound, the matter can be understood as a huge leap for transnational capital. Amazing how the economic, ideological, and personal, as a set of motivations, envisioned by key figures involved also reveal heretofore unknown arteries of capital. Backing power, politics, mobilization, and the consequent ruination. Secret history or conspiracy? Not at all. Yet why would a bunch of capitalists invest into a communist revolution? Instead of dealing with the question as conspiracy, the invisible hand of transnational capital which directs motivation as well as the power dynamics between so-called friends and enemies. Figures within Wall Street, bankers, moneylenders such as Jacob Schiff, Kuhn, Loeb and Co. actually distributed left-wing propaganda among thousands of Russian prisoners of war being held by the Japanese, 1902 to 1904. The following year was the first revolt against the Tsar. Pre-revolution, as traced back by author Richard Spence, shipment of Russian gold bullion out of Russia eventually into American vaults, undertaken via Olaf Ashberg's Nyaban Ken following the Guarantee Trust at Wall Street. Melted down in Sweden, the gold proceeded to Paris, then to London and eventually to New York, to Morgan Stanley Chase interests and partly for Jacob, Kuhn and Loeb's. Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. Millionaire Menshevik, Marxist Alexander Pavus and German banker Max Warburg invested in anticipation of the coming revolution. Simply put, Capital as an energizer for future market domination is more like a conspiracy fact, the massive windfall for Wall Street that would return to create new trans-capital projects between capitalists, socialists, fascists, and communists. William Wiseman, the head of British intelligence, who had made a fortune in Mexico, meat packing, and in Canada, frontier real estate, became a key figure in Wall Street, making the right connections with Bolsheviks, ending 1925. The year, as a fundamental change in direction for Soviet Russia. According to Richard Spencer, the transfer of technology and credits to the USSR as a continuous relationship between the Soviet state and Western capital, way before the Cold War period. Wall Street's role in the Bolshevik Revolution began as successfully lobbying against US trade and loans, and funding Japan's war against Russia. Yet such a vanguard economic strategy overshot in ways no one could foresee nor manage future blowback. Political ruptures and the escalation of bankrolled wars not just inside revolutionary Russia, but all over Europe and gradually around the world through the 20th century. Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. What did Wall Street achieve? Spence has a more plausible explanation and rejects the notion of a grand unified Wall Street conspiracy to dominate communist Russia. It simply points to the lowest hanging fruit vis-a-vis continuous warmongering for profit. Wall Street concerns that sought Russia as a market and the entire Far East, vast territories waiting for capital to plunder, backed by a set of investors following the logic of infinite growth and extraction, warring among themselves as any other business venture of the past or present enemy. Much like the coeval conflicts of interests in India, Africa, parts of South America and the Middle East, rival consortia battled around the planet, via hundreds of bankrolled projects, via agreements and imperial mandates using ever more destructive technologies. The same goes on today, albeit inside new regions, creating ever new detonator landscapes transforming the planet in irreversible ways. The entirely non-living entity of capital undermined frontiers as well as emperors, religions, savants, revolutionaries, and capitalist consortia alike. Freddie Perlman's World Eater against Leviathan. What makes revolutionary figures like Leon Trotsky become a traitor or some Wall Street agent versus Vladimir Lenin a wonderfully complete incarnation, Maxim Gorky, is secondary to capitalism and its outreach. Long live the revolution, and Vladimir Lenin is long dead. The heirs of his mind and of his will, despite everything, whatever a man creates that is true and honorable lives, that conquers without which there would be no men. As hilarious or ironic it sounds in hindsight, that a messiah would return with the message of Marxism to lead the seething roaring masses, or better even light up for mankind the path which shall lead it out of the shameful chaos of the present. 1928, Maxim Gorky. Whatever shameful chaos of the past, present and coming future, as blips and flashpoints within the timeline of the Capitalocene, and its cycles of world-making and world-destruction, boom and bust. Yet kudos to the actual mass, woman, man, and child. Mass of illiterate peasants, industrial workers, and Marx's lumpen proletariat to actually give up everything in the name of revolution or some new nation. Take up guns or share the loaf of bread for the common good or some new messiah. Kudos to the working class spirit that spilled over into many parts of the world, as rupture, revolution, or as emancipation. The question of end justifies the means as a continuous struggle and not revolutionary end. A return to the structure of a Greek tragedy and its modern counterpart. The death of spirituality in a world where almost everything is ordained by capital, Arnold Toynbee. The same insightful person who said Madison Avenue is a real danger to the West than communism. Long gone communism, the imaginary demons morphed into new cult figures and new enemies. We are at war, and we can't see it. Putin is coming. Donald Tusk, President of Poland. Little pigs of Europe cannot agree. Vladimir Putin. For capital, things like political ideologies, race, language, ethnicity, gender, class, were barriers but not specific to an empire or continent. Well on its way to create the final planetary prison, or the current world order webbed inside Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's one and only empire. The seduction of the modern human mind and body was perhaps capitalism's final frontier possible. Only then could things like mass media, mass entertainment, machine morality, and artificial intelligence evolve from the same technical, the unnatural, milieu. The techniques for shaping attitudes are psychological as well as technological. The technical milieu of control attacks the conscious and the unconscious at the same time. Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. Sigmund Freud's concomitant hell. The binary logic of Oedipus complex was the cornerstone of psychosexual development or disorder for a while. Sexually obsessed teenagers or children, according to Freud, turn to anger, guilt, and rejection, emotions which can fabricate all sorts of situations. As per the Oedipus complex, a son's sexual attitude towards his mother and concomitant hostility toward his father is first formed during the phallic stage of psychosexual development. Wikipedia. Freud was convinced that so was the daughter's case. The attitude of desire for her father and hostility toward her mother is referred to as the feminine or female Oedipus complex. The broad consensus thousands of experts derived from the famous The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899. The terms acquired further popularity in a special type of choice of object, made by men, 1910. Digging deeper in the etiology of hysteria, Freud betrayed his patients by recasting their memories as a psychosis of sexual fantasies. The turnaround is casting doubt on experiences that were most probably real, something psychologists often do. Whatever deep insights Freud may have framed, his brand of psychology is not just binary, reductionist, but also complicit in covering up sexual assault. Jeffrey M. Masson, The Assault on Truth. Masson unpublished dozens of letters written by Freud to his close friend Wilhelm Fliess, which reveal his grave doubts about abandoning the seduction theory. Masson discovered that not only was Freud documenting the high incidence of sexual abuse of children, he had in all likelihood witnessed autopsies of children who had been raped and murdered. Point being, Freud abandoned his seduction theory as a failure of courage rather than a lack of clinical success or theoretical insight. As a result, for decades most psychiatrists and psychoanalysts have in effect been reluctant to trust the memories of their patients. This becomes obvious with women in particular, about the traumas they experienced especially during childhood. How does Freud turn repression into the logical? Check out a recent critical analysis about Freud's Dangers of Tenderness by Julie Resch and Stephanie Cozier. In Oedipus Rex, the child's wishful fantasy that underlies it is brought into the open and realized as it would be in a dream, destroying that very capacity to dream and imagination of the so-called psychosexual development. Awarded for such a theory, his framework has simply given us many navel-gazing binaries. Is all about the self, about only you, that eclipses the capacity for objective shared truth and common healing. This type of nonsense, Oedipus Rex, is broad consensus across the West in terms mainstream psychology. Subdue trauma and traumatized people via pure analytical gaslighting. Professor Jiang, Empire of Evil, Evolving Role of Capital. Freud's sweeping observations that captured the so-called human psyche were popularized by the broader outreach of institutional psychology. However deep, the view is one side of a multidimensional phenomena. Schizophrenia within capitalist societies, Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, 1983, invalidated many Freudian mental maps and theories. Michael Foucault had opened up the debate earlier, in his Discipline and Punish, 1977. In 1981, J.M. Masson was fired from his position as director of the Sigmund Freud Archives, shortly after publishing a paper in New Haven, effectively unraveling the theory Freud had developed in 1895, the so-called seduction theory, as it may have been valid after all. Masson's discovery deeply scandalized not just Freudian fan clubs, but also academia, doctors, and leading psychoanalysts. This post is public. Your share and support is highly appreciated. Finding no clear binary or objective guidance, when we grapple with core questions, if ethical means are required for good ends, or if some great outcome justifies questionable actions. Is it okay to find ever new means to control and to dominate? Is it okay to slaughter the innocent at the foundations of almost every nation or settle a colonial project? Is it okay to unleash utterly destructive processes for some higher state? A state that is based on capital and not something actually sacred. Regardless, utterly misleading binaries and vanguards appear again and again with similar promises, sometimes worse than the previous. What is famously linked to a Machiavelli or Marx or Lenin's highest imperialism or Aldous Huxley's book Ends and Means, as the most influential, albeit part of a massive milieu, of messiahs, visionaries, philosophers, scientists, and revolutionary icons. 1,000 figures and thousands of historic events. Events that come to us, not we to them. Gunther Anders. Maybe the most relevant and spiritual experiences, events and ideas are waiting for us within, and not outside. To pledge support with a paid subscription, click here. Yes, it helps a lot.